So I have a pretty cool thing how I want to lead this next. Sim gave me, when he visited me, this book, Dune, that I have
Yeah.
not gotten the chance to read as much as I like. I've read like, I don't know, a bit into it, but really like it's really just about the time. But there's an amazing, well, not quote, it's called The Litany Against Fear. Yeah, it's in the book even before the book starts. So I wanted to read that to the audience, but I wanted, as it ties into the nervous system, I'd like to hear your take on what this really means. So,
Yeah.
The Litany Against Fear. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. So, what does that mean as it relates to the nervous system?
Yeah, so you already pointed it out, right? That fear stimulates anxiety. It's sympathetic, but it's a means to confront, right? So that's where a lot of the sympathetic is in the end, right? Because if something happens in the environment, we turn on. It's like we have these different programs to deal with this threat, right? Fight, flight, and freeze. So the fear is there, right? A lot of people think it's like, well, it's there to keep you safe, but not necessarily in like going to hide. A big part of it is like we need to attack the thing that is, that it forms a quote unquote threat.
Quickly, I noticed like fight or flight. I think because we don't have to fight all that much these days, so it's more like take action or flight, right?
Yes, yeah, it's the action of flight, because flight would be an action, right? Physiologically, it's like it would be running away. And in this case, it's a prompt to action, necessarily to keep us safe, to keep us surviving. And this is essentially what exposure therapy is about, right? It's dealing with fear in the constructive fashion that instead of bringing you away from the thing, right, it's bringing you towards the thing, but it's being done in a way that doesn't cross the threshold, right? So if you would want to face your fears, you don't start at the end, right? And this is what people like with asking these girls out, for instance, like you can start with very minor things or basic things, like start talking to a girl online, right? If that's the threshold, right? If you can't do that in person, that's already like one step. And I mean, the examples are, like if you want to get over your fear of spiders, like you look at a picture of a spider, right? And then you do that for as long as you can tolerate until that like shutdown mechanism starts coming in. And then you just kind of keep repeating that until in that phase, like you're good, right? And that's kind of where, like eventually you if we use the analogy of the spider, like you see the spider and everything is okay. And that's kind of where the quote comes from, like only I will remain, right? You kind of see that the fear goes through you, right? Kind of physiologically, it's true. It's kind of like you experience that, right? The adrenaline and the cortisol go through the body. And then once you get a hold of that, once you move through it, those hormones abate, right? So they go away. And it's like, oh, I'm back, right? And that's why only I will remain, because it's the little death type thing is because we, as with the cold exposure, like you just stop thinking, right? All of the, like, it's just survival mode. It's just reactive. It's like you kind of cease to exist in a moment cognitively, and everything is geared towards survival in a reactive fashion, right? Whereas if you've gotten used to handling the fear constructively, then you're still in the driver's seat, right?
Yeah. No, it's cool. I noticed that fear is like the emotion that makes us the least of ourselves of all of them, because of course we have different moods, and that with the nervous system that we talk about, with hormones, that, but it's fear that really can, you can feel like you're a different person, really.
Yes.
So how I interpret that quote is that, again, it can be the right thing to be afraid. If it's an actual threat here and you should get away or you should fight or whatever, But
Yeah.
we have, of course, from trauma or childhood or other things in our lives, we've gotten these triggers that don't really, we feel the fear when we really shouldn't, when it really doesn't serve us. And again, it's like it's going against ourselves. Like in my case with the stage fright, on the one hand, it was something I dreamt of. I know I have a talent for talking to people like this, but I had the fear of being seen for who I am. And that if I show myself like this and can even show that I'm nervous, people will be like, oh, I didn't know he was like that. And they will abandon me. Because that's one of the biggest fears for humans, right? To be being seen for who you are and rejected for it, right? And so when I was presented with those situations, I didn't feel like myself, because even if I was different back then, I could be like confident and laugh and charismatic back then too. But when I was in this situation, I just turned to this little person that, like, I'm not even, I don't have a personality. I'm just scared, So how I interpreted it is that when you manage to push through, like you said, you can put it on lower levels, but when you manage to push through, it's like the nervous system is kind of like, oh, it just senses that this was unnecessary. Let's deprogram. And what is then left? You.
So thanks, Robert, for the comment, by the way, that you're enjoying this. So why it makes us less us is a neurological thing, right? So your brain is made out of like an architecture of parts, right? I'm oversimplifying things greatly, but you have like the neocortex. So it's like, think of like 3 mushrooms. Like you have a little brainstem, there's like the limbic cortex on top and the neocortex on top of that. So the brainstem is all about like survival. It's literally the most basic thing in the human brain, right? That we share with reptilians and any other basic life form that is alive, right? That has a rudimentary nervous system. Because it just regulates body temperature, breathing, etc. So what happens basically is like if you think about it like as again using kind of the mushroom example, but now the neocortex is doing this, right? It's contracting, and fear, right? Because it has to do with survival. It's the highest, like, let's say, contractile thing, and a lot of the personality and who we think we are is really, more in the front here, right? So it's like squeezing everything down. And then it's like, I know, like for a lot of people, it gives people existential angst. Like, no, you're still a person, but it's like a lot of your personality is just, like in the prefrontal cortex alongside the limbic cortex, right? And like
your soul is,
like I said, it's more complicated than that, right? Because of all the interconnected things. But the more you move towards that, like brainstem, the more, like I said, reactive and instinctive you become, the more animalistic, the more it's like whatever, good things in your personality. Like if you were in a situation like where your life depended on it, right? Whether it's somebody's threatening your life or something, like facets of you, like you're not going to write a love letter. You're not going to build a house. You're not going to write poetry, right? That's not what's going to happen, right? So that's why, like, this whole thing, like, you become way less of who you are because of fear, because it's literally shrinking the capacity to be yourself when you're in a hyper reactive state, right, from the brainstem out. So that's, it will determine a lot of like how you are able to quote unquote show up as yourself when the fear is there, right? And once you do, right, it's basically the signal to the nervous system, like, oh, it's safe. And, instead of contracting, everything expands again. It's like, so we kind of do that. Like you see that with people, like when you're afraid, what do? Right? You contract, right? When you're not afraid, you expand, right? Because there's a lot of the viscera, right, in the gut here. So underneath the ribs and the throat, that's all vulnerable tissue. So when we're scared, we tend to protect the most vulnerable thing. So in fear, right, we're always trying to protect ourselves. So it physiologically in the brain and in the body, the same type of contracting and expanding happens, right, according to the signals that we perceive from the environment.
That's so cool. And so one question that we've talked about it without necessarily talking about the nervous system, just you and I before, but we talked, trauma that will give you different problems. It's very difficult to deal with, but we've also talked about how it can be sort of a superpower. This is what we talk, demons, slaying demons or taming the demon, rather. But so, yeah, because it seems like almost all high-performing people, it's not almost no one I've heard a story like, yeah, everything was just sunshine and rainbows for me growing up. It was almost always something like this. So I would guess, I guess my question is in a sense that, do you think that your potential to tolerate higher stress and stuff is higher if you went through a lot of stuff like that as you were growing up?
Well,